Thank you everyone for coming to our Majlis, and we have a wonderful guest, Stephen Judd today, who is an expert of Umayyad history and also Umayyad law, at a combination. And well, I'm people from Abbasid background, like me, we tend to think about the Umayyads as something before the things, before the real thing started. But I'm getting more and more fascinated by this period, and luckily Stephen will provide us a more general overview of the problematics of the study of this era and dynasty. So I'm very much looking forward to this. And well, yeah, I just wanted to say about Stephen that he is one of the most unassuming and kind people I've met. And I'm very interested in his introduction as well. Just the talk how life guided him as where he is now. Stephen, could you please start your Majlis?
Yes, of course. First, thank you, Isfan, for inviting me to do this and for your kind words. And I want to compliment you too on the sort of format of these events, because I think a lot of us are in the field and know each other's work or something about each other's work, but have no idea how we got here. And I think this introductory part of things, I think, is important and useful for all of us, and I very much appreciate that. That said, I'm kind of an unlikely person to end up here. I sort of call myself an unlikely accidental Orientalist or something like this, in that, first of all, I have no ties to the region of any sort, ethnically, religiously, or otherwise. I grew up in rural America in the state of Iowa. For those who are not familiar with American geography, it's the area where they grow corn, and that's about it. Small towns, very homogeneous, and I was the first in my family to go to college. My family's background is mostly agricultural, though my parents were not farmers. There was a family farm that loomed over everything in various ways. And so I went off to college, and I had really no connection to anything much larger than the American Midwest. In fact, I tried to remember, I think I got my first passport when I was 21 or 22. So I'm very much a parochial, sort of local Midwestern person. So how do I end up talking about the Umayyads and wandering around in Syria? This is something that happened as a result of being an undergraduate in college and studying history. And I stumbled into the Middle East as an undergraduate. I went to St. Olaf College, which is hardly a bastion of Middle East studies, but I had a particular professor there, a man named Michel Legal, and I don't know if any of you are familiar with his work. He worked on essentially 18th, 19th century Ottoman North African slave trade. So again, not a very Umayyad topic. But he taught, Middle Eastern history, and I became addicted and continued to study. That said, I didn't immediately pursue this. When I graduated from college, I took a couple of years before I decided to go on to graduate school. There were a number of reasons for that. One was my finances were in a rather dire strait, and so I needed to, make money and pay bills. And I also happened to stumble into a very good job, so it was comfortable. But I wasn't quite sure is this what I want to do or not? And so during those couple of years, I took some Arabic extension classes at the University of Minnesota, where I stumbled through a couple of years of Egyptian colloquial and decided that I could probably learn Arabic, and decided that it was time to head off for graduate school. So, and incidentally, in the midst of all this, I've married my wife, Natalie. And so a couple of months after we got married, I quit my job and we went off to the University of Michigan for graduate school. And she knew that was coming. So, so I didn't surprise her with that. And at Michigan, I worked with Michael Bonner. And of course, Michael is tragically no longer with us, of sudden death a few years ago. And in reflecting on Michael, at that time, I realized that he took a tremendous chance on me. I was not well prepared, and he was willing to give me a chance. I was, my Arabic, my other languages were not what they should be. Some would say they're still not where they should be, but I think we all have those feelings from time to time. And I wasn't entirely clear on what I was doing, except studying the Middle East and Middle East history in some sort of general sense. So he really took a tremendous chance on me, and I'm thankful for that. And if I had known better, I would have realized that I took a chance on him too, because I, hitched myself to an untenured assistant professor at a major research university, which I was his first graduate student. And so this was a very beneficial arrangement for us. And while I was at Michigan, I wandered around a bit in sort of various areas of studying Arabic Middle East or Islamic Middle East, and sort of eventually settled into thinking about the Umayyads. And some of this was a sort of, I looked at more modern things and sort of become increasingly disillusioned with modern things, and sort of slowly crept backwards until I found something I was comfortable in, which ended up being the Umayyads. And one of the reasons for this was I was fascinated because nobody was working on the Umayyads. This was the 1990s, and there was very little happening in the study of the history of the Umayyads. And this, of course, to put in context, and I'll talk about this a little more in my talk as well. And this is in the aftermath of the publication of Wansborough's work, and Cook and Krona and Calder and all of these other sort of deconstructionist scholars, where it became sort of accepted that you couldn't really write about the Umayyads and have any confidence in sources about the Umayyads and that kind of thing. So nobody was doing it. And perhaps stubborn, silly me, I decided to give it a shot, and eventually sort of wandered into the aspects of the Umayyads that I focused on, religious scholarship during the period, and also sort of Umayyad history in general. And so this is sort of my path to the field. In terms of my career path, I was fortunate that when I finished my dissertation, I actually got a job. The late 90s was not a pretty time in terms of the job market for academia in general and for the Middle East in particular. And so I got a job at the State University in New Haven, Connecticut, Southern Connecticut State University. We do offer master's degrees, but not doctorate degrees. I was to be the first Middle East scholar they'd ever had. And I am now still the only Middle East scholar they've ever had. And I was in the I'm in the history department there. And to be honest, I didn't think I would be there very long. I thought this was a stop on the path, to sort of moving on to bigger and better things. But a couple of things have kept me here. One is that I have really good colleagues within my own department. This is something that is, I think, extremely valuable for us as, having functional workplaces where your colleagues get along, and we all have or know of horror stories of situations where that's not the case. Another thing that kept me here is geographic. I live 2 miles from Yale, and I can use their libraries, so I can do my work. And in many American small college kinds of settings, that's not the case. To get to a major library where you can actually do your work, if I ended up back in Iowa, would have required airplanes. And so I can, go downtown, use the library. It's a very fine library. They didn't happen to have a medieval historian themselves, so no one was using the medieval history material in the library, and I could, really capitalize on that and continue to write and continue to research, despite not being at a research-focused institution. And so that was a real blessing. A couple of other things about sort of staying here too is, as I think I mentioned, I have a great deal of autonomy here, because I'm the only one who does anything Middle Eastern. So my colleagues have no idea what I'm talking about most of the time. There are disadvantages to that, but there are also advantages, right? People leave me alone and let me do my work, and they don't understand what I'm doing, so they don't ask a lot of questions about what I'm doing. And that has been helpful in some cases. And also, another reason I've committed to stay where I am is that I see a lot of first-generation college students, students who come from backgrounds where they are not financially well off, where no one in their family has ever dreamed of going to college before. And I feel a certain affinity for them based on my own story, and a need to, be there to show them that they can complete college and go off to graduate school and do whatever they want to do in life, even though they have not necessarily been born into circumstances that are sort of favorable to that. And so those are sort of some reasons why I have ended up where I am. And it's been, as I said, an unlikely story. 40 years ago when I was in high school, I don't think I would have thought this was what I would end up doing. Sometimes I wonder how I ended up doing this still. Most of the time I don't wonder if I should have done it, but we all have those moments as well. So, I guess what people can take from this sort of roundabout story of how I got here is that we all come here from different directions, and it's for those who are graduate students or recent PhDs who are on the line here, you don't have to end up at the top university to do interesting work and to contribute to academia. And that's something that I've been blessed to learn. So that's my story.
Thank you very much, Stephen. It was very edifying for me. Actually, this is also a reason I wanted to be here, because you are a prime scholar, and it's not the name of the institution what makes that. And again, your simplicity and sincerity is a lesson in itself. I just wanted to say something about the American colleges. When I was at Richmond, Virginia, the interlibrary loan was so good that I could have nearly everything within days. So even if you don't sit by accident, but 2 kilometers, 2 miles away from Yale's library, you can do very good research. I believe, if it's still the case. I don't know.
Yes, and that's a development that's happened in the last 10 or 15 years.
Yes.
Earlier than that, especially when you were looking for things like Arabic books, it was much more difficult because the requester had to know a little more about, or the library that is requesting would sometimes have difficulty making the request in such a way that people could find what you're looking for. So that's something that has improved dramatically in the last, in this internet age, I guess, as some things have improved. So.
Thank you very much, Stephen. The image was frozen. Was it just mine? It's my internet connection, right? Not yours. Okay. If mine is bad, that's not a problem. Yours would be more a problem. Okay. Thank you, Steve. Shall we continue?
We can, yes. Okay, I do have a PowerPoint as such. So let me see if we can share screen. Can we do this? What's happening? Oops, shoot.
I should probably. Okay.
What's happening? Hold on.
I need to make you co-host, I believe, which we normally do in advance. But Sarah, who is much more proficient in that, wasn't here now, and I forgot. Is it working now?
Let me see. How do I share this? Share screen. Here we go. No, it's not quite working. Hold on. There we are.
Thank you. Apologies. That's all my fault. We had such a nice discussion before we started. I forgot.
Oh, believe me, I am technologically quite challenged. You won't see any sort of magic things floating into slides or animation or any of those things. I can barely get words on the page. So my talk today is in many ways fairly general, and the Umayyad problem in Arabic history and historiography, but it addresses a concern that I think is important for us to focus on, in that the basic problem is that for studying the Umayyad period, we have an historiographical problem. Put simply, our sources are later, and our sources are always seen to be suspect. And that historiographical problem often affects the way that the history of the Umayyad era is written. And as Istvan mentioned, everything good starts with the Abbasids. It's very easy to ignore the Umayyads. And I think in doing that, we end up in a situation where we've missed literally a century that is crucial to the development of both Islamic religion and Middle Eastern history. And so what I'm going to talk about today is sort of look at the problem, and it's not just the sources that are the problem, it's the scholarship is the problem too, and talk a little bit about how we try to get at what is Umayyad and what the Umayyad era is all about. Again, this will be relatively general, but hopefully it will offer some insights. The source problem, let me see, is this, and it didn't switch slides. What are you guys seeing? Are you seeing the actual slideshow? Oh, here we go. That helps. So the source problem is essentially that the Abbasids write Umayyad history. And that's the core of it. We don't have Umayyad era sources. And if you look to any book or article or long article any of us who work on the Umayyads has written, we could start with a sort of long lament about the state of the sources and how this is such a problem and all of these sorts of things. But to try to write Umayyad history, essentially we have to use Abbasid era sources. And of course, these sources purport to preserve earlier material, some with nice, neat isnads, some without. But it's all presented through the lens of an Abbasid era understanding of the world. And that understanding is, of course, both religious and political. So you get to see the Umayyads from their successors and vanquishers point of view, which is a problem. In that mix, as you see, I've thrown up a picture of Tabari's work. Tabari looms so large over the history of medieval Islam and medieval Middle Eastern societies. And this is, in many ways, exacerbates some of the problems. Tabari is obviously a very important and significant work, but it is a work that I think has been, shall we say, praised a bit much. And it's curious because I've had situations where I've given talks and sort of pointed to problems in Tabari's text and issues where there's obviously some manipulation of sources going on. And I've had even very senior scholars scold me for disparaging Tabari. It really is very much embedded in our approach to things. And of course, Tabari is writing in the Abbasid court. He is not an unbiased source. And he has a vision of the Umayyad era that reflects his own time and his own concerns. One of the curious things I sort of stumble across is that we do find, and I'll talk about this a bit more later, there are some sources, Arabic sources, that don't really use Tabari, that ignore Tabari even, and people who had Tabari who would not cite him unless they didn't have any other source. And so his sort of preponderance or his sort of dominance of the field is something that, if we look a few centuries after him, was not necessarily the case. And so there's something going on there in our focus on Tabari. And I don't know if it is an accident of which manuscripts 19th century Orientalists decided merited having additions made, or if there's something else there. It's very interesting to think about. But of course, Tabari is a problem. As we know, and the rest of this slide is things we're all quite aware of. We don't have archives from the Umayyads. We have talk of diwans and tax records and all of these things, but we don't have them. We don't have, with a couple of exceptions, we don't have documents of any sort. And this is, of course, seen to be a serious source problem for studying the Umayyads. Those who study the Abbasids, though, don't have these things either. So it's kind of curious that it's a problem for the Umayyads, but not for the early Abbasid, especially the early Abbasid period. And of course, we have some archaeological and numismatic sources out there that are helpful. The tendency of again, 19th century archaeologists to sort of bulldoze off the later stuff to get to the Greek and Roman stuff has caused a great deal of damage in our use of those sorts of materials, as has the fact that a lot of the places that would be really interesting to dig are in the middle of modern cities. We don't know where the Umayyad palace in Damascus was, but you can't exactly go and start digging for it because it's a city. it's a built environment. So these sorts of problems are there with dealing with numismatic and archaeological sources as well. People have also suggested that we should turn to non-Arabic sources to sort of fill in the gaps. And this is a suggestion that I've always found a little bit curious, because first of all, these are relatively limited sources. We have Syriac sources, we have not a lot of Greek sources really on the period, but they're relatively limited sources, and they too are, infected by the agenda of the writers, the time of the writers, and most of them are not contemporaneous to the events that we see. And even if they are, their usefulness is somewhat limited. You are not going to get a clear understanding of the politics of the caliphal court from a Syriac text written in some local community in Iraq. Right? It's an outsider view that sees bits and pieces and might collaborate bits and pieces, but really is a problem and is not a panacea for the source issues that we face. So this is a sort of general introduction to the lament of why it's so hard to write Umayyad history. We don't have good sources in the Arabic sources. We don't have good sources in, material culture sources. We don't have good sources in non-Arabic sources, all of this stuff. And yet we try to write Umayyad history anyway, or some of us do. And these source problems are, I think, not problems that can't be overcome, but in a lot of ways, modern scholarship has sort of exacerbated the problems that we have with our sources. And I won't sort of dig through a long discussion of this, but I find for talking about this issue, actually, Fred Donner's sort of classification of different types of approaches to the sources is useful in describing these. And then, of course, that was 1998 in his narratives of Islamic origins. We have some more recent things that have added to that. He sort of breaks things down into a variety of approaches, and to go fairly quickly through this, the sort of descriptive approach is essentially just repeating the sources and providing the narrative that's in the sources without much analysis. And he focuses on people like William Muir, Philip Hitti, Claude Cahen. Interestingly, Donner adds Hugh Kennedy to this list. which is a bit fascinating. But this is basically, here's the sources, here's what they say, away we go. Not a lot of critical analysis as part of this, at least in Donner's view. And then, of course, we get the source critical approach, which starts arguably with Wellhausen and others, where you're dissecting the sources, looking for particular voices in the sources. And here we have a throwback to, Old Testament scholarship and looking for, different voices in the Pentateuch and all these sorts of things, and the priestly voice, the rabbi voice, all these sorts of things. What we end up with in the Arabic sources is a kind of regional school kind of attitude toward things, and the Iraqi source or the Kufan source versus the Basran source, and sort of taking things apart in that way, sort of tribal analyses and these kinds of things as people sort of look for different voices within the sources. This is useful, obviously, figuring out where, what voices are within the sources is useful, but as we'll see, there are some sorts of issues involving that we'll get to. The tradition critical approach, as Donner describes it, is essentially the dive into isnad criticism, Goldziher, Note, eventually Motsky and others who take apart our sources using the tools of the muhaddiths to sort of try to figure out what's going on within these sources through that direction. And then, of course, we get to the skeptics, and I've mentioned them before, Wansbrough, Krona, Cook, all of these, where our sources are essentially telling a salvation history story, which may or may not have any connection to what really happened, which blurs the lines between myth and history and all of these sorts of things. And if you sort of go down that rabbit hole far enough, can you really believe anything that anybody has written about the Umayyads? It's all part of the larger salvation history and all of these sorts of things. And before I sort of talk a little bit about the sort of where this all leads us, I should add that since the 90s, obviously we have some new things that have happened. The digital humanities, or sort of big data approaches to things, have come into play. I'm a bit skeptical of these approaches to things, partly because of my technical skills, but also I see a certain danger in taking massive databases of Arabic sources and sort of keyword searching your way through them. There are a couple of things that happen there. One is what I see with undergraduate papers, where they've gone to the library website and put in a couple of key phrases and found a bunch of articles about this and read a paragraph of each one, and then written a paper without ever actually reading an entire article. I think there's a bit of that danger in the big data approach, that will grab a paragraph from Maclise or wherever and not contextualize it within the whole work. And so I worry a bit about these approaches, but they are finding interesting things along the way. And then, of course, the more recent discussions of the concepts of historical memory. And here I'm thinking about the works of Antoine Barut and others, who are essentially, talking about the sources as thinking about how people reflect on the past. Ultimately, though, those works are an exercise in talking about Abbasid historiography rather than Umayyad or earlier history. Right? How did the Abbasids remember these events, which may or may not get you to, actually thinking about what actually happened. So all of the scholarship, of course, is voluminous and much of it brilliant, but it does present a problem for us in studying the Umayyads. One of the things we see is that when people talk about sort of earlier Islamic history, pre-Abbasid history, often they're really talking about Muhammad and the Rashidun. We kind of skip over the Umayyads because everybody wants to get at how Islam began in that early Medinan phase, and we see a lot of this sort of historiographical work focusing on how those times are perceived. And this, of course, makes it easy to kind of skip over the Umayyads. And when we sort of throw on top of that the sort of salvation history, religious history approach to things, what we see in Abbasid sources is a sort of an interpretation, a very common interpretation of the Umayyads as a period of shall we say, less than godly rule, or an interregnum of Arab kings. And if we think about Wellhausen's book, it's the Arab kingdom. It's not the Umayyad Caliphate. It's not the Islamic Empire. It's Arabs, kings. and this sort of, Mulk versus Khalifa kind of thing that's going on there. And so the Umayyads, in that salvation history narrative written by the Abbasids, have a role to play, right? They are the bad times before the Abbasid saviors show up and put us back on the right path. And that interpretation that is evident in Abbasid era sources seems to continue to be accepted and permeates the Western scholarship. To suggest that the Umayyads were actively engaged in shaping Islamic religion, that's a bit controversial at times. It doesn't fit the standard narrative. And even if we think about, say works like God's Caliph for this sort of concept, this is a sort of seen to be a sort of Umayyad sort of perversion of things to, use religion to claim power as opposed to something genuine. That Abbasid bias sort of sneaks in there and pervades a lot of the work on the Umayyads, and particularly when we get to topics of religion. My first book on Umayyad scholars, or religious scholars in the Umayyads, the idea that there are people who are pious religious scholars who will actually work for or even associate with the Umayyads is something people had to be convinced of. And this is, again, the sources, the biases of the sources compounded by the biases of researchers who sort of instinctively question the Umayyad period for some reason. So this leaves us in a rather difficult situation in talking about the Umayyads. And one of the things to point out in all of this sort of discussion of sources we've had is all of these approaches to the sources aren't really aimed at figuring out what actually happened during the Umayyads. It's about picking apart sources or how people remembered things 200 years later. It's not really getting at the meat of trying to figure out what was actually going on during the Umayyad period. And trying to figure out what's going on in the Umayyad period has been my focus, and that's a difficult task. Even thinking about what is Umayyad, is there an Umayyad culture? Is there an Umayyad sort of religious attitude? What makes the Umayyads Umayyad is something that really is sort of glossed over and not addressed necessarily. And of course, to start with, even before we get to what is the Umayyads, you have to ask, when were the Umayyads? This Umayyad period is arguably in some ways a construct of later historical sources. And there are those who would argue that Uthman is the first Umayyad. Muawiyah presents himself as the avenger of Uthman. It's a family of Uthman, all of this. So why don't we start the Umayyad period with Uthman? Especially if you reject Ali, and then we've got the Umayyad period beginning in 23,644 and going on from then. That's an interesting sort of thing to think about, is do the first Umayyads in Syria see themselves as a continuation of Uthman's reign? Did people at the time see it that way? And we do find, in the sources once in a while a reference to the Uthmaniyya. Lots of discussion about what in the world that is. Is that a political label? Is it some sort of religious anti-Shiite label? But the idea that somehow the Umayyads are associated with Uthman kind of fades out in our periodization of things. The other question is, we have the Sufyanids, we have the Marwanids. Are these separate dynasties? Should they be seen as separate dynasties? If you draw the sort of genealogical tree, and they're connected, but not exactly directly. Arguably, the rule of the Sufyanids is different from the rule of the Marwanids. Should we separate them in some way? And at times I've talked about the Marwanids because a lot of things sort of fall into order once we get to Abdul Malik in ways that make life a lot easier than thinking about what's going on with the Sufyanids as well. And so, this is a question too, is why aren't we talking about the Marwanid dynasty as opposed to the Umayyad dynasty with the Sufyanids as kind of an interlude? Or why aren't we thinking about Uthman as the beginner of all of this? And then, of course, we have the Zubayrids. Ibn al-Zubayr was in charge of most of the Muslim world, for a number of years. Was he, as Chase Robinson and others have suggested, essentially the de facto caliph, and Marwan and Abdul Malik are sort of holdouts in Syria or quasi-rebels of some sort? It's an interesting question. And I think also, historiographically speaking, the fact that our later historical sources don't really suggest the idea that, the Zubayrids were a caliphate, or because Ibn al-Zubayr was a caliph. They sort of, pick this Umayyad trajectory and sort of sideline Ibn al-Zubayr. Is that reflective of the reality of the time, or is that an Abbasid era construct to make things a little simpler than trying to sort out what we do with Ibn al-Zubayr? And then, of course, another question that people don't ask, but probably should, is when did the Umayyads end? We use 750, 132, 750 as an end date. When, of course, is when Marwan II is killed while running away in Egypt. But there are other end dates we could use. Is it the murder of al-Walid ibn Yazid, who is the last Umayyad caliph who was generally accepted universally or almost universally? If we're not sure about al-Walid, do we think maybe Hisham's death marks the end of the Umayyads and everything after that is chaos? Do we make something of the fact that Marwan II actually moved the capital out to Haran, out of Damascus, or at least de facto did this? Does that represent a shift to an attempt to begin a new dynasty of some sort? Or, and of course, do we go to Al-Andalus and continue the Umayyad dynasty there? These are interesting questions about defining what is Umayyad, and even getting a time period to study is one of the problems that we face. Myself, I have ultimately settled on the sort of traditional understanding of Muawiyah to Marwan II, simply because that's the period when Syria was essentially the capital, with the sort of Zubayrid problem to deal with, and that this is, Syria as a capital of a dynasty sort of makes a period that works in some ways, and that may have been what the Abbasid historians did too, in thinking about this. But it's a problem that we need to recognize and unpack and contemplate along the way. Now, the other sort of question is, as I mentioned before, what is Umayyad? Is there an Umayyad culture? Is there an Umayyad aesthetic? Is there an Umayyad version of Islam that we can think about. And this is perhaps in some ways a harder question to think about what is distinct about the Umayyads, but it's important to recognize that the Umayyads themselves created and achieved a great deal. Let me, to sort of throw out the sort of standard list here. It's during the Umayyad period that we hit maximum territorial expansion for a sort of semi-unified Islamic empire. It's during this period that, regardless of your sort of takes on various theories of the emergence of Islam, whether this is, the Donner believers movement sort of morphing into a distinct religion, or whether it is, begun from Muhammad's time, is really during the Umayyad period that's, things are articulated and clarified, and we start to talk about, orthodoxy and proper beliefs, and you start to have offices of judges and roles assigned to people and discussions of law. All of these things are happening during the Umayyad period. Arabic. The Umayyads decided that Arabic was going to be the lingua franca, and they did a remarkably good job of accomplishing that in the long run. And as I mentioned, the sort of institution of the caliphate is really an Umayyad invention. Of course, the Rashidun are caliphs, but their context is different from, it's hard to think of Rashidun Medina as an imperial capital of an empire. It's still a sort of loose tribal community. The caliph doesn't have a palace, those kinds of things that we see start to develop during the Umayyad period. And of course, tremendous wealth is accumulated. And one thing I find especially fascinating is the things that the Umayyads built. There are some really incredibly impressive construction that went on. And we have, examples, the obviously the Dome of the Rock, the Umayyad Mosque, the mosaics at Kibat al-Mafjar, all of these sorts of things are far more opulent than what we have surviving from the early Abbasid period. I guess Samarra is bigger than a lot of things, but certainly not as wealthy or fancy or opulent as some of the Umayyad construction. So is there an artistic aesthetic there that is distinctly Umayyad that is emerging? And we're starting to see some people work on that, think about that. But it's, these accomplishments again get kind of, shunted aside in lots of ways. And the sources themselves do give us a sort of standard narrative of the Umayyads. For the most part, it is almost suspiciously standard. If you take Tabari and Ibn al-Athir and a couple of others and lay them down side by side, they're often exactly the same without citing their sources necessarily. And the sort of timeline is pretty standardized. You'll get a disagreement of a year or two on a birth date, or a month or two on a death date, or something like this, but it's pretty well standardized. And so we do have this narrative that has been constructed later on, suggesting that during the Abbasid period, people are trying to create a standard narrative, and not just sort of throwing everything they have into their books, as some people might suggest. We also get the sort of incorporation of interpretive constructs to try to explain things. Here, if we look to Abbasid sources, we get the whole case Yemen narrative going, and I become, this seems to be a tool for explaining events. What it represents is, of course, much debated, but what I suspect is that the sort of identity of Qais in Yemen and the use of these sort of tribal blocks that may or may not have actually existed to explain things is an effort from the Abbasid period to explain these conflicts going on amongst the Umayyads. Why are these two groups fighting? Oh, well, to find some paradigm to create two sides. And I suspect that Abbasid historians are doing that. And as we all know, you can play around with tribal genealogies and create entirely different, blocks if you want to. So I suspect that's a later interpretive tool. But one thing, of course, to make clear is that the narrative completely collapses at the end of the Umayyads. Making sense of the last 5 years or so is extraordinarily difficult because whatever sort of paradigms are being used to explain things just don't seem to work anymore. And indeed, what kind of interpretive tool could you use to explain why sons of Hisham, the Umayyad Caliph, end up joining the Kharijites? Where do you find a tool that will explain that? Things are happening here that no one can understand, and I think the Abbasid sources reflect that people are terribly confused about this. And this era is something I've tried to dig into, and I still don't have answers about. See, how are we doing on time, Astronom?
In theory, you have four minutes.
Okay, so I will be relatively quick then. One of the things that we should also note is that the Umayyads.
But please feel free to go as you wish.
Okay, I'll take a little more time. Is there such? We talk about Abbasid historiography explaining the Umayyads, and the question is whether there was an Umayyad historiography. And here I keep coming back to the interesting character of al-Zuhri. We know, of course, al-Zuhri was commissioned by Hisham to write hadith, in part so his kids didn't have to go mix with the riffraff, but he also wrote history, and he hired himself out to write tribal histories and these kinds of things. Is he a sort of elite caliphal historian? Is he trying to tell the Umayyad story from their viewpoint? Somehow, despite working for the Umayyads and making a lot of money off of the Umayyads, he is not, he doesn't lose his reputation. And he shows up in all of the hadith collections. In fact, let's see, long ago I sort of sorted through this when he's 600 isnads in Bukhari, 1,200 in Ibn Hanbal's Musnad, more citations in the 6 books than we have for Nafi ibn Omar. I mean, it's a pretty substantial hadith scholar, and his historical writings, are out there. I would love to see someone take the time to, go and sort of cherry pick everything that al-Zuhri says about history and put it together in a history by al-Zuhri, or tidbits of history by al-Zuhri. But what it suggests is that there is a Syrian or Umayyad period, even regime-sponsored interest in history, an interest in telling their story. And this kind of flies in the face of a lot of what we think, where historical writing starts with the Abbasids. All the fun stuff starts with the Abbasids. And even Donner, asserts that there was not much interest in historical narrative during this early period, but we have someone being paid to write these things in al-Zuhri. So it seems that there's something going on there, that we can maybe dig into the sources from this direction, looking for Umayyad things rather than discounting them, and look at al-Zuhri as an example. One of the things that I've done as well is actually looked to much later sources, and this, of course, is heresy in the search for early sources that we have. But I mentioned earlier that there are sources that don't fall into this sort of Tabari-centric, Iraqi-centric kind of world. And the most significant of those is Ibn Asakir's Tariq Damashq, which, as we know, he's very late. He's sponsored by Nuruddin. But one of the things I find interesting is that in many of his biographies of important Umayyad figures, he does not use Tabari. I know that he had Tabari because there are a few places where he does use him. And when you have, all right, he's got a little bit of Tabari for this year and a little bit of Tabari for that year, but all this really important stuff happening in between, he ignores Tabari. And so there seems to be amongst, slightly later medieval historians, a willingness to, look elsewhere. And the sort of Iraqi Tabari ibn al-Athir kind of narrative is not universally held. It's just noticed much more by Western scholars. And some of the other sort of later Syrian sources, Zahabi, Ibn al-Adini, all of these others are also doing the same thing, often then, using Ibn Asakir. So sometimes our obsession with early sources arguably ends up being an obsession with the Tabari, who had an agenda, who told a story, but there seems to be material out there to tell other stories. And it's in this manner that I've tried to get around some of the historiographical problems. To sort of wrap things up fairly quickly, as I've said ad nauseum, the sources plus the biases of the sources combined with the biases of modern scholars makes it difficult to write about the Umayyads. But it's a period that can't be ignored and can't be glossed over as a sort of, it's a century where we can say a few words and, have a 10-page chapter and then get to the Abbasids and talk about every little thing the Abbasids did. One of the questions I sort of come to, and this at the very conclusion, is, are we in some ways being too hard on ourselves here? This obsession with finding collaborating sources from other traditions or other languages, we don't do that for medieval French history or medieval British history, but somehow we trust the little bits we have there without trying to find some Germanic source to confirm what happened in England in 1022 or whenever. We sort of subject ourselves to higher standards in terms of sources here. And we complain about not having archives and documents. How do we write ancient Greek history if we have to have archives and documents? How do we write any medieval history if we have to have archives and documents? But we seem to be obsessed with having these kinds of sources that we don't. And of course, we all know that historical chronicles have a certain legendary, fictitious element to them. Indeed, modern history books on things that happened 10 years ago have that in them. But we find ways to, work around it and to acknowledge it and still try to write something about what happened without beating ourselves up over it quite as much as we do for medieval Islamic history, and particularly for Umayyad history. So I sometimes wonder if we're just being too hard on ourselves in demanding for the study of the Umayyads things that we wouldn't demand from other periods or other cultures. And frankly, even for the Abbasids. So we let things slide for the Abbasids, and we don't necessarily let happen for the Umayyads in terms of thinking about our sources. So this is my sort of general discussion of, the problem we have with dealing with the Umayyads. It's a source problem. It's a scholarship problem. but it's one we have to deal with if we're going to understand how we got to the Abbasids, whom everyone seems to be very interested in studying, and understand how Islam actually developed. And so I've tried to find ways to do that. They're imperfect, as is all scholarship, but I hope I've sort of given you an idea of the problem and how I've tried to look at it here. So thank you. Let me get rid of, okay, stop there. There we go.
Thank you very much, Stephen. And of course, there is the whole question of the continuity between the Abbasid and the Umayyad, whether because we tend to insist on a rupture between the two, but in fact it seems much less the case. Well,
yes, it is interesting how many sort of government officials reappear 10 years later. But that's the case in any revolution, of course. The people who know how to run things find their way back into positions of running things.
Yeah, well, including the Umayyad family itself, as it
Yes.
to begin with. Yes, and then well, it's just an interesting case that Ibn al-Muqaffa, who is my keyhole to many things, he never managed, he never vanished from administration. He remained at the high heights until he was killed, but it was an inter-Abbasid affair. And just an example of that everyone talks about the Khalilabad Imna as an Abbasid, as done for the Abbasids. Do we have any sources saying it was done for the Abbasids? He may have well done this during the Umayyads. Why not? So it's just one specific case when there is this assumed thing that it must be something Umayyad. Well, thank you very much again. And then before concluding this the second part of our session and getting to the questions, I'd like to advertise the next Majlis, which will be an Ottoman Majlis after an Umayyad one. I put here that by Helen Pfeiffer from Cambridge. I hope many of you can come to that one as well. Okay, I stop the recording and we start the question and discussions.